Hey, what's up? I bet you didn't think I was going to be back so soon because I didn't even think I was going to be back so soon. Like I said before, I just watched Weapons, the new Zach Cregger film, Friday evening, and I wanted to record some loose improvised thoughts, and I genuinely thought that was going to be it, one and done. But then Saturday morning, I watched the previous film directed by Zach Cregger, Barbarian, and here I am 3,475 words later, back at it like a Zach addict. Maybe it's because this whole Shyamalan project and that's affecting the way that I watch movies, especially horror movies. Maybe it's because I'm still insisting to myself that I'm a real movie critic or something, or maybe it's just because before I got married and changed my last name, Zach Cregger would be the movie director I'm most alphabetically similar to, but this weekend I'm just really locked into the Creggerverse. I did a Creepy Cregger double feature and I want to talk about it, so apologize for spamming you all, but here we are, the very unplanned episode 2 of Shyam-all-like. I'm your host, Zach. This time at least I did sit down to write out my thoughts rather than just going completely off the cuff, so if I'm way off base or anything, I don't really have that excuse to hide behind anymore, so let's all hope I'm not talking out my butt. But I'll try to at least get through all this quickly, so at least I'm not wasting any more of your time than I have to. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but if you haven't, you should go see Barbarian. Absolutely watch that before listening to me unpack it here. You should go in as blind as possible and just wait to see where the movie will take you. For extra context, up until about a week ago, if you'd asked me what I would call Zach Cregger's greatest creative work, I of course would have said The Whitest Kids You Know, Sketch Gallon, and PCP. I really hadn't seen any more of his recent stuff, nor had I read any analysis or critique of it. I just perpetually kept telling myself, yeah, that looks good, I'll get to it one of these days. After watching Weapons and Barbarian, I then watched the half-hour Real Blend interview with Zach Cregger talking about Barbarian, but I otherwise haven't looked into any writing or analysis on his works, since I didn't want anything to unintentionally influence my thoughts here. Genuine apologies if I'm just spending all this time and effort merely restating something that's been said half a dozen times, but if you do have anything like that you know of, that you've seen or heard, you should send that my way. I'd be really interested. I'm going to start off talking about, the Shyamalan connection, if there is one even here, because that's ostensibly the purpose of what I'm doing, but then I want to spend a little time unpacking one particular element of the gender politics written into this movie, which in truth is actually the part that got my brain wanting to work through and unpack what I just watched. If you'll stick around for that, I'd appreciate it, but, do what you want, I guess. Okay, that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so, yes, let's start off with first what is supposedly the premise of this little exercise. Do I think Barbarian is a Shyamalan-like? I'd actually say yeah, and a good bit more than Weapons, to be honest. I watched Weapons and felt some kind of tenuous through line I wanted to ramble about and connect to a kind of amalgamation of the Shyamalan we've watched so far, vaguely the happening staging with the kind of knock at the cabin camera work mixed in, yada yada yada. But Barbarian feels like it carries the Shyamalan DNA to a much more identifiable extent. I haven't seen anything yet from Cregger and Company that cites Shyamalan as an influence, so Zach, if you're listening, please hit me up. I do want to know if I'm onto anything here. First off, the big one, the twist. This is the reason why myself and others have been encouraging potential viewers to go in as blind as possible. Partway through the movie, we have a big reveal and we learn that what we had assumed to be the main threat actually isn't, and there's a much more conventional scary movie monster threat literally lurking beneath the surface. I struggle to say that this is 100% a Shyamalan twist, even given my current mid-journey less than full understanding of the Shyamalan twist at this point in time, mainly because it isn't a twist ending, it's a twist midpoint. From the way I understand it, the Shyamalan twist usually takes place right at the end to make you rethink what's happened, but instead here in Barbarian, it occurs about 30 or 40 minutes in, so you rather have time to sit in and experience what's happening and what's going to happen with the remaining runtime. It throws you off and keeps you guessing, rather than having you look back and reevaluating, so maybe my connection here is spotty. Despite that, it feels much closer to the Shyamalan twist than anything in Weapons, and I felt some reason to talk about that one, so while Weapons has a similar midpoint reveal, it's more of a mystery for the first half hour where you don't know what the answer will be up until you get an answer at the midpoint. In Barbarian, on the other hand, you're very much led to think one thing and you may feel pretty confident in where the movie's going for the first 30 minutes when suddenly they pull the rug out to reveal something completely different. That's about all I can say between the two without giving away the whole goose. Outside of that, it really does feel in concept and setting like it could fit into the Shyamalan oeuvre. Barbarian's premise functions as a similar elevator pitchable concept forward movie like we've seen from M. Night a few times here. What if you were a woman alone at night in an unfamiliar town and you get to your Airbnb but it's double booked so a stranger you've never met is already staying there? For me at least fits in pretty well right beside what if you were vacationing at an isolated cabin where 4 strangers show up and tell you that you need to sacrifice someone to prevent the apocalypse? And slightly less beside Beach That Makes You Old. As far as quote-unquote concept-forward movies go, if we're accepting this term that the three of us here made up. Going off of that, this choice of setting also gives the movie a solid reason to pull the recurring Shyamalan motif we've previously discussed several times of taking place almost entirely within a single contained location, a la Knock at the Cabin, The Visit, Trap Split, and or Glass. And because of that, it does feel like Cregger and his cinematographer Cooperstein, similar to Shyamalan and his various cinematographers, make an effort to continually find new ways to stage, shoot, and present the same recurring locations to keep it not only visually interesting, but to reframe the same locations contextually as safe, dangerous, or something else as the movie goes along and situations change. In the Real Blend interview, he mentions that they aim for David Fincher above ground and Sam Raimi below ground, which is a fun little fact, and it makes me wonder if potentially Shyamalan himself is some kind of blend that you get combining Fincher and Raimi. Food for thought, I guess. Feel free to agree or disagree. So, is this a Shyamalan-like? Yeah, I think so. Thanks for joining me. This has been the second episode of M. Night Shyamalan-like, aka the season finale of Oeuvre Ahead, Season 2.5, the Cregger Picture, Cregger Longer and Uncut. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Okay, thanks for sticking around. In the words of our modern-day oracle and patron saint of Twitter, Drill, this whole thing smacks of gender. So now if you'll just indulge me for a couple minutes and let me talk about something completely unrelated about the movie that I really like. There's, at least in my mind, a really fascinating thematic exploration here related to gender and gender-based violence in the modern world and how we see different types of men exhibit and play into that gender-based violence. If you're listening to this, I'm going to ask that you try to listen with an open heart and an open mind, and even if you don't agree with anything I say, at least approach the topic in good faith. That's about all I can ask. Barbarian really felt to me like it could only exist as a post-Me Too era movie, but not in the way that most people would immediately think of when they hear the phrase post-Me Too era movie. First of all, by nature of being a post-Me Too era movie written by what seems to be a pretty well-meaning guy in the way that he thinks about or has observed gender violence perpetrated against women by men along a spectrum of harm, rather than being written by a woman relating to her experience in the world as a woman like you typically expect. It's almost like Kreger's turning to the dudes out there and saying, okay, listen up. So it's very much an exploration of masculinity and masculine-specific violence and how a woman might be forced to respond to all the shapes that can take. In the Real Blend interview, he mentions that the original idea for this movie came from a portion of the nonfiction book The Gift of Fear by security specialist named Gavin de Becker, where Gavin lists a bunch of red flags of men that may or may not present danger individually, but paint a risk of danger to women when grouped together. So Kreger started off work on this movie by writing out a scene where a guy displays as many of those listed red flags as possible, and then it went from there. That's how we get the premise of the surprise roommate at the Airbnb who seems to be trying to be nice but still creates an unsettling and dangerous vibe. But what's important here is that in the movie, the character Keith, played by Pennywise the Clown himself, Bill Skarsgård, is set up to be the assumed villain based on both the character and audience hopefully picking up those red flags, until it's revealed that he actually might just be an okay dude who didn't mean any harm and then gets killed by the real threat. I do find it worth mentioning that when it comes to men versus women reading and responding appropriately to red flags and the dangerous situations, that the one other normal female character that Tess interacts with immediately clocks the situation and says, yeah, no, that's a really sketchy part of town, you shouldn't be staying in that Airbnb, compared to Keith, who, even after he sees Tess get locked in the basement, break out, and then pack up saying that something's wrong and encouraging both of them to get out of the house and drive away as soon as they can, he still exudes a typical masculine confidence and wanders into the secret torture dungeon to check it out, only to get killed. That's not even a stretch for me to say. There's literally a scene earlier where Tess points out that if it was reversed and he got to the house late at night only to find her already there, that he'd be able to just wander right in with no concern at all. That would be kind of funny to me, but it did make me recall a time a couple years back when I was staying alone at an Airbnb and mentioned where I was staying to a female friend of mine that previously lived in the area, and she immediately said, yeah, no, that's a really sketchy part of town, you shouldn't be staying at that Airbnb. I then continued to stay there for a couple nights, so despite all of my "no you idiot, don't go down there" horror movie commentary with Keith, I know that I'm certifiably closer to Keith's survivability index than the Tess survivability index. Anyway, it's really interesting how Kreger plays with expectations in the first half of this movie and how he ends up using his few male characters to create the spectrum of societal-wide omnipresent patriarchal harm against women. Bill Skarsgård as Keith and James Butler as the homeless man named Andre both present as men that don't seem to actually be a threat, but unintentionally through their behavior in the situation appear as a potential threat to a woman when she's reading into reasonable red flags. While I was watching, I thought that Keith was potentially meant to be a stand-in for any quote-unquote one of the good ones, i.e. any well-meaning, not intentionally sexist man that could be watching, in the sense that due to the ever-present patriarchal society we live in, even the most kind-hearted and well-intentioned men among us can probably all look back and think of at least one interaction we had with a woman where we might come to realize, oh, in retrospect, that could have been seen the wrong way and freaked her out even if I didn't mean to. After I watched the movie, I got to the part in the Real Blend interview where Kreger says that Keith was very much written based on how he would likely act as the man in the situation, so I felt very vindicated in my observation. Next up, Justin Long's #canceled actor character AJ, who seems to represent a step up in the masculine violence spectrum. A guy that throughout the movie has done clear harm to the women around him, but through self-justification and self-rationalization, along with some help justifying and rationalizing from his friends and peers, believes himself to be a good guy who maybe just did some bad things. Obviously, your interpretation of his character and the situation he's introduced with will vary based on your own personal views and experiences, but I do think that towards the end, where he monologues about how he could in theory save Tess to atone for what he's done, only to in practice, very quickly, sell her out and sacrifice for the first chance he gets, is a pretty bold and apparent statement about how much lying goes into all the self-rationalizing he and guys like him are really doing and how big of a piece of crap he and they really are. The casting of Justin Long here as this innocent and disarming kind of guy who has this darker, selfish interior feels like it just worked out perfectly for what they were going for here. It kind of feels reminiscent of the gag from This Is the End, where the quiet, soft-spoken Michael Cera is actually an out-of-control violent drug addict, or like that Lonely Island SNL rap with Natalie Portman, but it really goes deeper than that. If you consider yourself to be even a little, quote-unquote, online, then the situation of this media personality outwardly appearing as an ooh-woo soft boy who then actually turns out to have some serious sexual allegations against him might make you think of a couple names from recent years, and it really tells me that Kreger probably knows about what's been going on in the culture, and he really aimed to thread that needle with his character, even if just for a portion of his audience to pick up on it. And then, at the clear other highest possible end of this harm spectrum, we have Richard Brake as Frank, an almost comically evil and despicable serial killer and rapist who builds a torture dungeon into his basement so he can commit multi-generational acts of sexual violence against the women that he kidnaps off the street. The absolute worst possible guy you could write, essentially. He's interesting in that he's almost living as a relic of another time and bygone era of misogynistic violence, if I can say that. Like, the movie uses him to contrast the previous widespread fear women had during the golden age of serial killers in the 70s and 80s, a la Ted Bundy picking up vulnerable female hitchhikers and college students to torture, compared to the modern widespread fear that women experience through services like Uber and Airbnb, where you're by design put into a vulnerable situation, and you can just hope that pretty much the entirely unregulated move fast and break things company making the service has some kind of vetting process that you can trust for the men who own the cars and houses you're getting into. But while on the surface that feels like a very different kind of dangerous situation that women have to worry about, here we see that the serial killer torture house of yesteryear quietly transitioned over time into the Airbnb house of today, so it very much feels like the same omnipresent violence just continued in a new form. The scene where they flash back to introduce Frank also feels very aggressively bright and sunny, very shiny happy suburbs hiding a dark secret. To me at least, it's incredibly reminiscent of the opening and closing shots of the film Blue Velvet, so his character feels lynching to me, not in the way people typically use that word to mean surreal, but more so in the sense of digging up and showing off all the gross bugs living under the well-manicured lawn. Like Bob Leland from Twin Peaks. I like it. Kreger did mention using a David Lynch technique of meditatively fishing for ideas when writing this movie, so I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's a pretty safe bet that David Lynch is a solid influence of his. And then there's the cops. They act as a stand-in to me how cops, especially male cops, are notoriously pretty much useless at actually addressing and preventing male violence against women. If you're a guy listening and you don't believe me, I'd encourage you to look up some pretty sobering statistics, and if you're a woman listening, I probably don't have to explain anything at all. Without any spoilers, Kreger has the cops play a pretty similar role in Weapons, and it's kind of funny to me to have useless cops as a running motif in 2 out of 2 horror movies so far. And that's really the main thrust of what I wanted to talk about. That's nowhere near an exhaustive look at everything having to do with gender and society that you could finesse from this picture, but just one element I really honed on while watching. Also, I'm sure there's been writing and analysis like they're out there for years, and I doubt I'm breaking new ground, but without seeing any of that for myself, this is what I found most interesting, specifically being a man watching this movie. I think any man watching can theoretically be placed somewhere in that spectrum I laid out. I'd obviously hope that most fall into the Keith side of things, but even in the Keith zone, as we'll call it, I think it's very important to be mindful and self-aware of your place within the context of the unwilling nature of our society, i.e. the differences between the world that men live in versus the world that women live in, and understand how your behavior and actions play into how women have to respond and navigate the world in order to be safe, even if you didn't and don't mean to cause any harm. It feels like Zach Kreger has some really interesting things to say, but he's not going to get in your face about it and wants to leave a lot of it to the audience to work out their own personal meanings. And these are some of the personal meanings I got out of it. I had a good time watching and then thinking of what I just watched. This approach seems to be working out well for him. I've definitely seen people online unpacking weapons this past weekend, so I'm looking forward to what he does next. I'm sorry I'm so late to the game on this one. Kreger heads rise up. Alright, I'm done. Thanks for joining me. Aaron Hans, I promise I'll stop doing this. See you all next time with a normal episode.